Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Stefan Killer-Haug. I'm the communications manager of Treasury here in lovely Munich, Germany. And today I feel really excited because we have a very special guest for you today and a very interesting topic, which is essentially, of course, as always, about data privacy to some extent, but this time this will be about human rights activism. It will be about mass surveillance abuse, so serious talk today. But before we dive into the matter, we will have some housekeeping notes that I wanted to share with you in advance. So this session is being recorded and therefore you will be able to watch this later on our YouTube channel and some other places probably too. But I'd advise you to stay and ask your questions with the Q&A button, as our guest speaker will be able to stay with us and answer hopefully every question you have. So ask them just right away, write them down, ask them later, whatever you prefer. But I think we should stop talking about housekeeping and dive right into this. So this is our guest. He's a fighter for human rights. He's an investigative researcher. He's a book author. And all his work led him to a Nobel Peace Prize nomination in 2017. He says, tech like AI is in the hands of the wrong people, at least, a weapon of mass disinformation, and you cannot do a thing that is private on the internet in China. What he means with this and what he tries to share with us, he will be talking about this in a minute. So welcome, Ethan Gutmann. It's good to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
So what is it like to do field research on human rights violations in or near China and other autocratic systems? And how did you manage to shield confidential information?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I just mentioned something. I'm in my grandmother's house, and that's my grandfather, in fact, was an anthropologist and spent a lot of time in Chiapas, Mexico. So this stuff is, and my father also was a psychologist who did field work out in Navajo Indian reservations and the Golan Heights and places like that. So this is very much something that just comes out of my background. Having said that, yes, once human rights gets in your blood, you kind of get dedicated to it. You kind of get that, you get that bug. And I've never really been able to shake it. Now, we had a very specific, the field, if you like, of organ harvesting. And I'm not going to get into that today. I just want to mention that it's there. If you've heard about it, you may have heard some skeptical or seen some skeptical comments in the comment section that appear in the web everywhere. I'm not really paying attention to those these days because Congress just passed the the House of Representatives just passed the Stop Organ Harvesting Act of 2023, just a couple of months ago.
Maybe just background to the audience. Sorry to interrupt you, Ethan.
Sure.
Some people aren't aware of you being the author of a book about organ harvesting and this matter.
There's a lot of people involved in this field. I mean, I've written a book that had a lot of impact, even though it was kind of a late hit, which was called The Slaughter, and that came out in 2014. Basically, the accusation against China is that they are not only taking death row prisoners and taking their organs, extracting their organs, and then selling them to either Chinese citizens or to foreigners in China. And but they're also doing it to political and religious prisoners, like Falun Gong. And now, some of you, most of you will be aware of, you've certainly heard something has been happening to this group called the Uyghurs. People mispronounce that all the time. It's very easy to say, actually, to say Uyghur. You can Americanize it. And the Uyghurs are a Muslim group, though there's a lot of reasons why they're being persecuted. And a lot of that probably has more to do with ethnicity than their spiritual preferences. But the key thing is that we knew, and it has been understood for a long time as I said, in Congress, at the top levels. Intelligence knows about this. And to a great extent, we've just seen a massive shift in the medical community as well. I just did the keynote address for the International Society for Heart and Lung Transplantation, their annual conference, and that was 3,600 screaming fans, transplant doctors in the audience, listening to me for half an hour, and they pretty much knew what I was going to say. So you can, I wasn't going to say everything's fine and we can just move on at all. And so the fact is, this is a fairly settled issue, but without information, without showing that this is happening currently or not happening currently, there's going to be a different attitude about what to do about all this. And so a couple of years ago, we knew that the Uyghurs had been blood tested en masse. Literally everybody above the age of 12 had been told to show up at these centers and be given health checks. And this included a blood test, which was also had a DNA test connected with it, and so forth. Now, these weren't actual tests where people, they sort of wrote you a little letter a couple of weeks later and sort of said, you've got you're hypoglycemic or something like that. There literally was no follow-up.
And there wasn't no standard procedure either, right?
It was just that the procedure it's incredible. I've seen films of it that were taken surreptitiously. It was absolutely, you couldn't take them openly. And it's just a bunch of people sort of crowded in looking desperate and sad. They're really awful to watch. But the point is, most people were not really thinking about this in terms of organ harvesting. They were thinking about this in terms of surveillance of this population. I tend to think about it in terms of organ harvesting, but I needed to find out if that was true. And I can't enter China. Going into China is anyone I would talk to in that Uyghur community or in the Falun Gong community or House Christian or Tibetan for that matter. It is a death sentence for them to talk to me, even if I could get into the country, which I probably can't. So I had to do something else, which is to look for the refugees, the few people who've made it out. And we're talking about a very, very small number of people who've made it out of this region of Western China called Xinjiang. Now that region borders on 3 states, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan. And those borders are slightly porous, slightly, especially in Kazakhstan, because there's a lot of there's a Kazakh minority inside China. And they have family members on the other side of the border and so forth. And they are nomadic people. That's their origins. And so Kazakhs in some cases were able to get out. They weren't as much the focus of this as the Uyghurs anyways, and they were able to get out. And then they would sort of go into hiding and presumably with a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder, they'd sort of hide out in Kazakhstan. Well, for me to get in there and ask questions in Kazakhstan, I had a problem, which is that my book did make me a little bit, famous in human rights circles, which is very low compared to the Kardashians or something like that, but it's still there. There's a Wikipedia page, it's a little controversial. It's on me. And I said, well, how do I do this? And the way I came up with, after talking to some people in intelligence and so forth, well, they said, well, why don't you just try seeing if you can slip in by car? Well, that was actually my idea originally. Was I said, if I come in by plane, they're going to look at me on the border. They're going to take the scan of my face. And very shortly after, they're going to put a tail on me. They're going to follow everything I do. And that means and that's not a big concern for me. Who cares, right? And even if they were to pull me into questioning, that's good for the sales of my next book if I get thrown in jail for a night. Let's be frank. But I couldn't do this to the witnesses. The witnesses have family back in China in many cases. These people it's almost a hostage situation. These people can be rounded up very quickly. And if it's discovered that they're talking to me. So I have to protect them. And that is the number one priority is, first of all, do no harm. Okay. All right. That's the background.
So we're talking about harm. Sorry, we need to dive into this a bit more, I think. So what was the accusations actually?
Well, what I was looking for was, I said, how do we determine, since the Chinese have a complete blackout now on any medical data about transplants, really, and we know that the transplant data they come up with is in many cases just AI generated. They just take an equation and show a graph of people volunteering their organs, and it's a perfect parabolic curve and so forth. So we know it's bunk, and we used to get a lot of research out of the medical community that we could kind of intercept, and you could data scrape the web to get it. But that's gone. So there's only one way, which is these refugees from camps. Now, they were in the camps, and these camps hold about 1 million. Some people say 3 million people. Even the State Department makes an estimate saying 3,800,000. That was their estimate. So let's assume 1 million. That's plenty, okay, for a population of about 15 million Uyghurs. But within that, only a handful had come out to the West. We'd gotten less than 10 people who'd actually made it out of the camps and made it over to the West. And I did interview those people. But what we really needed was all these Kazakhs. That's where the bulk of the witnesses were hanging out. And now we're talking about maybe 1,000 people. Now, most of those people will not want to talk because they want to forget what they went through. And they don't want to take any risks in a surveillance state, which Kazakhstan is. And so the question was, well, but if I can get to some of them and I can ask them questions about what they saw in the camp and not tip my hand that I'm looking into organ harvesting, well, I've got a very good sample there. And particularly because the Uyghurs, they're not Uyghurs in most cases, they're Kazakhs. So this isn't their fight. That makes them very dependable witnesses. They don't have they're not likely to exaggerate their stories as much. But to get in, the way I finally determined, long story short, is I recruited my foster daughter, who's 24, beautiful girl, very smart and intelligent. And I said, how do you feel about going on a skiing holiday to Kazakhstan? And we got a car that was a 2003 with four-wheel drive, because past 2005, basically cars have computer chips in them, which can be monitored all the way. So you're really never alone. But we got this 2003 in Germany, and we put skis on the top of the car and loaded the car up with silly hats and books about the snow leopard and all kinds of things like that. And we drove to Kazakhstan.
From Germany.
From Germany, which means we took the Black Sea ferry. Back then you could do that in Odessa, and that gets you out. We got to see a lot of interesting places along the way, and we then had to wait for almost a week in Baku for the ferry, which does not have a schedule, which takes you over to Kazakhstan. This is a truck driver route. Okay, that's pretty much all you meet on this route is truck drivers who were very interested in my daughter, but fortunately they respect a familial relationship like we had. So that was our scheme, and we did that. And then what we did was, once we got to, actually just before we got to Kazakhstan, we turned off all the devices, put them in Faraday cages. Stalin makes a very nice kind of leather case, which has a kind of tinfoil inside and kind of holds all the information. We turned off all the devices, never to turn them on again. And we just operated with a map. It was actually in German, because that's the only one we could really find.
Like a paper map.
A paper map and a compass, all right? And
I think many of us aren't really used to using these kinds of maps anymore.
Well, I'm a little older than you, so I do actually remember using a map and a compass before.
Good for you.
We soon determined that the car would throw off the compass. So that meant I had to get out of the car to do a compass check. And it was freezing cold. This is winter. We decided to go. That was my other idea, was to go kind of during Christmas, because that's a very long, drawn out period where the security gets a little lax. which also meant we had to deal with a lot of snow, and they don't plow the roads in Kazakhstan, roads such as they are. Point is that we basically disappeared. We got through the border check, which was very thorough, and they did biometric pictures of our faces and so forth, and then we disappeared. We literally could not be found. And the only thing we had was some burner phones that we picked up in Georgia. So we had these burner phones that we could use to contact the people I'd set up on the other side of the country, in Kazakhstan, in Almaty. And so we could say, look, we're halfway through the country or whatever, we should be arriving in 2 days, this kind of. All right, so that's all very romantic and so forth. But the payoff to this was that then when we got to Almaty, we had a safe house, an apartment, which did not have our names on it. And I just figured out a way to pay the person, and we had this place. And it was very close to a sort of fancy mall in Almaty, maybe one of the fanciest malls in the whole country. And we would send out a translator or fixer who we were working with that day and say, meet this person at such and such. You can do Starbucks if you wanted to, and make them put their device into the Stalin bag, the Faraday cage, and then lead them up to the apartment, and we'll interview them. Now that is very different from what I pictured, driving around and doing all these things, but actually was the safest way to do this. And so I was able to collect, over 2 months, we were able to collect a lot of interviews using this method. And I was able to actually generate some numbers that about 25 to 50,000 people every year were going missing from the camp, average age 28, and pretty clearly they were being used for organ harvesting, because this was always preceded by a health check with the blood test and so forth. And the age that we know that the Chinese establishment prefers to harvest people at is 28 years old or 29, right in there. Okay, your organs are very healthy, but they've stopped growing. This is perfect. Okay. All right. The question was, what do we do? How do we get rid of this information? I had all these tapes. I mean, I'd been using these devices, but I'd completely cut off the internet angle of it. We hadn't even turned on a phone. The only thing we turned on was a burner phone the whole time we were there for 2 months. We finally had a kind of a phone we were able to acquire, and that was very difficult. It had somebody else's name on it. And we used that to drive around town because we kept getting lost without GPS. Okay. And so that saved a lot of time. But the bottom line was, nobody really could track our position. Nobody could track the witness's position. Nobody could track the fact that the witness had spoken to us. Now, how do we get rid of the information? And I don't know what kind of detail you want to get into here, but I have an embarrassing fashion.
You're free.
Okay. Yes, you'd like. This embarrassing confession is that I thought we could do it through FedEx. I thought, well, they have a FedEx office here in Almaty. It's an international city. This will be fine. We went to the FedEx office. I had tapes, the recordings. I packaged them all into one very neat data stick. I encrypted that. And we had notes from the interviews. And the man behind the counter, I was there with my fixer and translator, and he kind of quietly, almost without moving his lips, looked at the stuff for a little while and said, you know, they're going to, state security is going to look at this. In other words, the police, this really secret police, are going to be looking at this material. Now, that is not something you expect from FedEx. I mean, they're perfectly within their rights to look at your material, but you just assume, well, they work for FedEx.
So to make this perfectly clear, these people at the border there check each and every package you're trying to give?
Dude, this is just a FedEx office in Almaty. Okay. It's real clean, looks nice. It's like being home. But the guy, without moving his lips, said, in Kazakh, not Russian. So I think it's harder to even interpret, because he obviously is being filmed by something. Said, you know, they're going to look at this. And I'm ashamed to say that I actually walked out saying, okay. And then my picture translator said, Ethan, what are you doing? Okay, you know, it's like lives there. And I said, you're right. I went back in and he said, I haven't sent it yet. Did you want something? And I said, yeah, we don't need to send it today. Thank you. We appreciate all the time you spent on this.
So how did you move on then?
Well, then that night, we were about to leave the next day to drive back to Germany, actually to London. And we said, okay, I said, let's turn on the devices. Let's just try to send this out through WeTransfer.com. The minute I did, devices started immediately. We turned on 2 devices. They both started loading up with all this internet activity, which hadn't, you know, they had all these emails started pouring in and so forth. And we tried to send it with WeTransfer and it didn't work. It just slowed down to a crawl. And I said, oh my God, this is something I've seen before in China. When they're monitoring you, everything slows down. That's the first sign. I got very paranoid, very excited.
So it wasn't about
full
connectivity with some network?
Look, I don't know exactly, and I don't want to make rash accusations, but I sense that WeTransfer, seeing something coming from Kazakhstan, has a problem. I've sent files like that before. And I don't know what their problem is, and I don't know who they're sharing it or who's watching. I have no idea. But I know that's not a safe way to send information. So we had no choice. We had to drive to the Russian border. It took about 3 days. We protected the information. We took pictures of it. Of course, we never used analog. We always never used digital. We always used analog. My daughter, black and white photographer, she'd take the Nikon and take pictures of these, what we needed, because we figure you get into the border, it's very unlikely they're going to actually develop your black and white film there. Okay, unless they really, you know, hold you in for a while. A lot of the recordings were actually made on tape and using a dictaphone. That was very important. That's the most secure method that you can use, is go completely off the grid. And we got to that border, and that's where the nightmare became. I mean, we were suddenly hanging by a thread. We're sitting there in this kind of nasty border. I remember our shoes were all full of cold water and so forth from melting snow. And there's 2 Russian women, border officials. And one of them is looking at me, obviously, on the web. And I can hear her say, who is he? I understand a little bit of Russian. Who is he? He's a writer. He's soft. What kind of writer? He writes about human rights. Who's his target? He said, China, China. Okay, so, but they're like, well, no, Russia, no, but they're arguing back and forth. And they're like, what are we doing letting these people through? Yeah, we only had a 5-day visa. It's just a transit visa. Just get through the country, get back to Europe. But this was the moment, and that was the moment where they could have just pulled the car apart and found an every data stick. They would have looked through it. It didn't matter how much garbage we disguised with it. We put all kinds of silly images and songs and things like that on there. And I'm sure they would have been very thorough. They decided not to go that way. And when I got through that border, I said, never, ever will I take a chance like that again. I will never do that to the witnesses. I put them at terrible risk here. Now, I believe it's necessary. It's good to get the interviews. I came out with conclusions. That's partly why the bill just passed in Congress. But I don't have the right to put people at risk in that way. And
So
that
you need
was
to go
where,
to Europe as the safe harbor, so to speak.
oh yes, and once we got through Russia, we had a good time in Moscow. It was interesting and everything. We then, the minute we finally got across the border in, I believe, Lithuania, my daughter turned on the device and just turned on her phone and just took a picture. We're in the Schengen zone. I took a selfie. We immediately contacted our relatives. I hadn't spoken to my wife the entire time. The only reason she knew I was alive was because I'd slipped down to Kyrgyzstan and taken some money out. And I knew she'd see that I'd taken cash out in Kyrgyzstan. That was my way of saying, I'm here, I'm alive. But normally we never used a bank card of any kind or a credit card of any kind, because it gives away your position. Now, all of that is very appropriate for Kazakhstan, because this is a fairly advanced state, and it's not only sort of heavily infiltrated by China, but it's also, of course, Russian. So it has Russian security, and the Russians are really second to none in many ways when it comes to security. I think their security is much better than their army, actually, as far as I can tell. The interesting thing was that they, so we knew that it was all electronic security in that country. And we knew that once we got out of Russia, that was it. We were clean and ready to go. But that moment of sitting there and having your fate, the fate, not of my fate, but the fate of these people who I'd interviewed, who put their trust in me, hanging by some discussion between two Russian broads. I mean, what this is not where I want to be. And it was that point where I started looking into, because I knew I was going back. And this time it was to an even probably more difficult environment. It was Tajikistan. Specifically to look into how many Uyghurs had been deported from Tajikistan by Chinese orders. Very, very sensitive topic. Nobody had ever investigated it on the ground. We were interested in getting the World Court to look into this and examine it. To do that this time, I was introduced by a couple of people who do human rights security and regular security, who mentioned Trezoret. And the more I looked into Trezoret, the more I became convinced this was the best answer. It was a reasonably small company, but had a very good record. A lot of the things I like to use are things like Threema. They're smaller, a little smaller than me, a little more off the beaten track. The price was reasonable. And they were basically would give me the ability to do an interview, send it off, take it off the computer completely, delete it, and you're clean. So even if you were stopped by the police, which was completely plausible that you would be, especially in Tajikistan and in Kazakhstan, we were stopped by the police very often. There was nothing for them to find. There's literally, sort of tourist pictures and that kind of thing. And then we could stay connected while we were there. We would actually use the devices. And that is how it worked.
President talking about here.
This is, okay, so 2020 is Kazakhstan. So 2021 was Tajikistan. Then the next year after that was Turkey, where I was basically getting a family out of Kyrgyzstan, out of Bishkek, and transporting them to America. And to do that we had to spend a long time in Turkey waiting for this was a family that was going to be deported from Bishkek, and the father would have been killed, and the wife, who was Kyrgyz, would have gone to pine away in the mountains somewhere, and the son probably would have been turned into an operative if they could have done that. It's a very bright boy. They're in America now. Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security finally agreed to let them in. But that was also a fairly tense situation, because Istanbul, as much as it's a great city and a wonderful place, and I encourage anybody to go there, does have some Chinese operatives in it. And they were very, very angry about the fact that my friend Connor Healy of IPVM had gone into Bishkek and pulled them out, just plucked them out in a single night. He bought their tickets for the plane an hour before the flight. I mean, it was like Argo or something. All right. It was like, okay, that wasn't quite the gun, men in guns pursuing the plane as it left on the runway, but there was that feeling of we have left the airspace of Central Asia. I mean,
Sounds like the holiday, not holiday, Hollywood thrill, so to speak.
Well, I mean, there's some aspects of that. I wanted to go and sort of collect them because this was a guy I discovered while I'd been in Kyrgyzstan. And I wanted to go help them. But I was at that point, I think we were known to the Kyrgyz police and to the Tajik police. They figured out what we were doing. So he came in and was able to do this, and it was a brilliant job. And what I'm saying here again is even in a reasonably friendly country, Turkey's a NATO country, it's like, you have to worry about surveillance. You have to be concerned about this. Now, everything I'm saying so far today, I mean, these are nice, interesting stories maybe, but the fact is, and they may seem so extreme, but the fact is, lower the volume here, and you have a situation that we're all in to some extent. Look, I happen, the paranoid's real, fake world is my real world to some extent. There is a government, China, Beijing, if you like, that is throwing banana peels in front of my path. Okay, all right, they actually do. There's been lots of attempts to take over my computer and that sort of thing. But the truth is, we all live in that world in some form. We all have competitors, enemies, even disgruntled employees. I mean, there are all kinds of possibilities where we just simply cannot allow people to go into certain areas because certain doors have to remain locked.
And let me just quickly come in here. So you've traveled the world actually, trying to help people in need to stand up for their fundamental rights. And you've mentioned Turkey, you've mentioned Kazakhstan, you've mentioned China and many other places. So what would you think was the most dicey situation you were in which country?
Well, I think Tajikistan was the most difficult because, for another reason, because they simply did not rely, in fact, on, the nice thing about being surveillance when it's electronic is you're not really aware of it. Right? I mean, you're just they're picking you up, they're doing a facial recognition on you. You're walking in the square, they know it's you.
Then it's again about new tech, advanced tech, AI.
Exactly.
We're talking about everything which is on the news actually when it comes to dystopian visions or something. But as we've experienced, this is not just a thing of the East, so to speak. We also have tendencies in Europe these days, for example, and in the UK. Call it online safety bill, call it the chat control, which is essentially about weakening private communications. So this is a thing that is probably valid for many places in the world, and it doesn't really matter where you are. It probably doesn't matter what you do. It's probably better to not be a human rights activist.
Well, let me revert back to the human rights activist point to pick up on what I think you're getting at. There are two views within the human rights community of people who do sort of stuff like kind of what I do. I'm not the only person at all, but the one view is we just need to collect all the witness information we can get and put it on the web. Okay, it's a very I don't know. I guess people like that are attracted to some of the Snowden and people like that. I mean, there's a tendency to say if we just put it all out there, there's too many. It's like crowdsourcing. There's just too many targets to go after. Look, first of all, I don't believe that. I spent a lot of time in China. They don't mind having lots of targets. Target-rich environments good. Okay, but leaving aside that, I do believe that there are cases that, I mean, I think that's basically, they're not wrong. It's most of what you do should be out there. That's partly why I'm on this program. First of all, I can't do the same tricks every time. So I can reveal some of the methods I use. They're not that hard to, I'll have to do something else next time. But a lot of what you can do is like that triangle. You know, you basically, there's a huge part of the third of that triangle is enormous size, and you can do it right out in the open. There's another part which is semi-confidential, has got to be kept sort of among friends. And there's a tippy top part there where you really have to hold on to the information. And that you have to be completely confident about. And I think that's true in the business world too. So I don't think this is just a human rights phenomenon. As I say, I mean, businesses, I've worked in business world, at least in China, and with American and European companies. And, we saw this all the time, that, brands would get stolen, products would just get imitated, within 3 months of entering a market, it was gone away, or even before it got to the market. It's probably an apocryphal story, but a famous one among expats was somebody driving, and they're out in the Chinese countryside, and this businessman from America gets lost, and he drives over a hill, and there's his factory. He's like, okay, I've arrived. This is great. I don't know how I found my way back here, but I did. It wasn't his factory. It was a completely a perfect imitation of his factory with another name on it. And it was making exactly the same product for the Chinese market. They were selling it at a considerable discount. Whether that's true or not, there's something, again, that's the banana peel point. And that's not just true about China. That's true about many business environments these days. And so I would have to say that, people put so much work into insurance and legal insurance, and they should have that kind of thing. I wish I had it. But it is also true that your information is everything. And the idea that you can put your information on, say, Google Drive, Google Documents, Google has Google has relationships. Google has relationships with companies. That's why it's free, because they make that money. They do it through advertising. They do it through sharing your information, not your most important stuff, but sharing some aspect of your information with a wider audience. And that wider audience also, first of all, for me, that wider audience operates in China. So that's a real problem, because we know that I've been witness to it, where companies have given up secrets to China because Beijing demanded it. But it's not just that. I mean, there's many areas of potential security breaches here, even if a company is very good, even if a company is very well-meaning. You mentioned WeTransfer. Look, I have really no idea about that company. They seem very nice people, very interesting and so forth. It's a good system, but there's something wrong with the fact that, first of all, they're looking at what I'm doing. Trezor never did that. Trezor never said, sometimes when I was in Tajikistan, I had a hard time uploading that interview, but that was just because we have horrible data. We have horrible connectivity in that country. It's a bit of a third world basket case country. That is not the same. Trezor had never rejected a file. And this was when you ask what was the tensest moment was when we got out to the border with China and actually started driving along that border, because I had a theory that there was some sort of military installation there, and I wanted to see it, and I wanted to photograph even very quickly. And when we did that, there it was. And we knew they were looking at us. They had Jeeps and all kinds of vehicles, and the first thing I did when we sort of got to this truck stop where it had some internet connectivity was I shot up those photographs to Trezor, put them up there, and got rid of them and deleted them as quickly as I could. It's a fairly straightforward thing. I mean, I don't want to overdo this point. Everybody is not in a situation where there's a question of life and death. These were very difficult situations. But I think,
on the other hand, coming back to the point, when people are aware or are not aware of providers sharing data with third parties. They don't want them to, maybe. Do you think the behavior has slightly changed within the people's minds after Cambridge Analytica and all the people that were at risk and all these Western values maybe that were at stake? Or how do you feel about the current situation?
Well, I feel that basically it's one of these things you can practically set your watch by it. That China does some major breach, and then we have, sort of the public becomes aware of it. And there's a lot of talk on MSNBC and CBNC, and about whatever data breaches happened, or there's these Cambridge Analytica situations like that. And then people go back to kind of a complacency. And I don't intend to do that. My intention is to stick with these systems. I did feel I have a deep mistrust of the cloud. Okay. And I think it's legitimate. And unless there is a carefully fenced off area of it, I'm not really comfortable storing data there. Okay. I believe in backing up my data in physical forms. Okay. I don't believe in keeping very sensitive stuff on my hard drive or in the cloud, except with Tresorit. Now, Tresorit has now become my major secret file cabinet. That's the way I use it.
And why is that? Why do
well,
you
it's very easy to cooperate with other. It's very easy. For one thing, it's very easy to cooperate, just like Google Docs or something like that. It's very easy to sort of give somebody an invitation, say, come look at this. You want to work together on this interview or this aspect, or maybe a lot of stuff we do has images. That's all fine and good. But the main reason is that if you can, I'm paying for it. I mean, the main reason is basically I'm paying for this service. And experts who are above, and I think maybe experts, people like at IPVM, have said that they trust Tresorit and they don't trust other systems. So I'm, it's like Consumer Reports used to be when I was growing up. That's like, I'll put some stock into Consumer Reports. They actually do legitimate testing of these products. So for that reason, I'm very comfortable. I don't lose sleep over Tresorit being available. And I did have kind of an on and off switch for Tresorit on my computer, so that if I were getting in trouble, say in Tajikistan, that I could kind of block Signal and block Tresorit. Now, no plan is perfect. If, I sort of, started tearing out my thumbnails or something like that and saying, why don't you tell us what your code is? Who knows what would happen? No plan is perfect. Nothing, but that never happened. But I think there's one other point I wanted to address that you were getting at. You see, we learned that these systems, that there's data breaches, but we learned about them way after the fact. That's the point. So there's this kind of weird confidence in the business community and the human rights community too, for that matter, that if there was a problem with any one of these systems that we're using, like Google Docs or something, we'd know about it. It'd be on the front pages, Wall Street Journal or something. I don't believe that's true. And I know that because I saw problems like this in China that never got reported. In fact, my very first book was about reporting some of those problems. So I'd have to say, we can't have that kind of confidence that the media is acting in a true watchdog role anymore. I don't believe it is.
Well, what you're actually explaining here is a kind of critical situation for the cyberspace in general, from what I feel. And people are highly confused about the way they should navigate this new cyberspace, probably. And as you said, this isn't just about human rights activism. This could be also about ordinary people like you and or like me, not like you, you are a human rights activist, but ordinary people like me going on business trips, having confidential data that is maybe getting the victim of a cyber breach and sabotage or whatever. So what would you say, how we can navigate this new kind of cyberspace where cybercrime, cyber war is everyday life, so to speak?
I can't say how to do it. I don't have that kind of expertise. I have a kind of I'm more like a common foot soldier, and I wouldn't know how to run a campaign, so to speak. But within that, I mean, those are my kind of rules. You have to find a part of the cloud. If you're going to use the cloud at all, this is pretty much the only option if you don't ever want to go through a border situation like the one I described. Again, you're going to have to, then you need to find a part of the cloud you trust. Okay. You need to find a part of the cloud you trust, a part of the cloud you trust, and you can trust other people to access it if you give certain people permission. And you don't want that process to be too tedious, not too arduous, or no, not too difficult. You don't want to spend a lot of money. You're willing to spend something because you need that. It's just like taking out a subscription. Sometimes that's the only thing to do. In this case, I consider it, as I say, a really, really good insurance policy for confidential data. These are interviews. I have interviews on my Trezorate account. These interviews, the Chinese, for example, can do voice prints. And even if the person's name isn't on the interview, they can figure out who it is. Believe it or not, they really have that capability. There are documents that, okay, they don't have nuclear secrets, but they're pretty meaningful documents to me. Okay. So I think it's important. I'll give you an example. I mean, we had at one point, I worked with Adrian Zentz, and he came out with a fantastic thing, the Xinjiang police files. Now, he has some deep throat, some hacker, somebody in the Politburo who has been giving him amazing information for some time now, and he comes out with it. When the Xinjiang police files came out, initially, it was not well protected. It was in a situation where it could have been hacked. Now, if it had been hacked quickly, they took care of that problem within the first day. So I'm proud to say I was a little bit part of that process. But if it had been hacked, you could have taken AI-generated photos of, we had all these photos of victims, of people who were in the camps, mugshots. And you could have taken them and replaced them with AI-generated photos of Uyghurs, and then revealed that some of these photographs were AI-generated. And then where would you be? You've lost all credibility. That actually happened with somebody else who used that same kind of file. They tried to fill in some of the policemen with using AI. They tried to use some shots of policemen, and they ended up at one point with a guy who plays a policeman on TV in China. You can imagine what the Chinese did with that information. They said, well, this discredits everything, right? That is one of the most dangerous things. I mean, it's always been true that with companies, if you could alter financial data, if that is, if you can do that, it's not so much a question of sinking. It's not Pearl Harbor. The ships come right back up. The problem is, what if they're not the same ships exactly? And that's what you have to guard against. And I believe that is really, really essential. That's one of the most essential insurance policies you can take out.
So now we're talking disinformation and deep fakes right now.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this problem is only going to get worse and worse and worse. Initially, that was a mistake that somebody else did to themselves. It was an own goal. It was, it was a mistake that didn't have to happen. They tried to fill in using AI. They tried to fill in some of the police pictures, and the AI ended up putting in a guy who played a policeman, because visually it's the same thing. very famous actor.
And this is an important part of the discussion, I think, that gets lost during the course of many discussions, that we have these new technologies and we have its new capabilities, actually, that maybe have been out there at some places in the world, but not, for mass consumption. And now there's this dynamic evolution. So therefore, we have, on the one hand, on the left side, so to speak, we have artists, we have creatives, and we have this side to the story. But on the other hand, we have the dark web, for example, and we have these wrong hands, so to speak, that leverage this for example, using AI for generating code, ransomware as a service, all these kinds of things that are out there right now. So what we should try to do, in my opinion, is to take a deeper look at the ethics behind it, actually, to look at ethics by design when it comes to AI development, for example, and also privacy by design methods when, trying to get these solutions out there on a bigger scale. But I think we're not there at the moment. Many people are thinking and talking about this on the official level, I think. But this is exactly what you said, actually. Once it's, this high level of threat, so that you can fake information that should be confidential, for example, this will be dystopia for sure. But in my opinion, we won't end up there. It was the same story and the same narrative, I think, with each and every new technology or digital technology. But this is what we should keep in mind and what we should be aware of.
Well, I'm going to push back a little there. I mean, I don't believe there's an arc of history here. Look, I've seen my own field deteriorate before my eyes. My last book back in 2014, this new book now, is obviously we've been talking about some of the issues in it today, and I like to talk about the security aspect of this. But I didn't put anything like that in my last book because it wasn't a real issue. I mean, I could go around the world interviewing Falun Gong refugees. Now, I couldn't go into China. Okay, fair enough. They made that really impossible and difficult. But I could go to Hong Kong. I could go to Taiwan. I could go to Dharamsala. I could go to Australia, North America, and Canada, and all these places, and just interview refugees. And a lot of them were getting out. What happened then is that the Chinese complicated things because they turned this into, if you were looking at this stuff, they basically turned you into a spy. And they worked out arrangements with countries like Kazakhstan and Tajikistan and so forth, and even Turkey to some extent, where they said, you don't want this kind of information emerging from Turkey, for example. You don't want people talking about that they were doing slave labor in China, that they're Uyghurs. They did slave labor. They worked in the fields, or they worked in some terrible factory, or they worked in prison. You don't want them talking about that. It'll make you look bad, and it'll make us look bad. We just simply don't want that. So a lot of countries went along. It's much easier to just go along with that. And a lot of countries are all using the surveillance that they did not, these surveillance capabilities that initially maybe they had some ethical concern about, some restraints involved in that. That's gone. Okay, all the countries are using that now. And AI is going to do that. It's going to be that times 10, in my opinion. I mean, right now we're seeing a little bit of resistance, to this. Maybe we're going too far and so forth. Do you think that resistance is going on in China? I don't think so. I think they're going on full speed, and it's evolving. At full speed ahead. It's evolving very quickly, and they're going to the worst possible stance, which is they're trying to make AI, which makes more AI. Okay, and that's where you're replicating. That's truly dangerous, and so I'm not sure how I feel about that. I don't know. I mean, I'd like to feel the way you're describing it, that this is ultimately these things will settle down and we'll get through it. But that didn't happen in human rights. And what it's done, and it's not the end of the world, but it's forced people like me who aren't really spies by nature, which is why I thought maybe Federal Express was a perfectly good way to send a bunch of data from Kazakhstan. Okay. But it's not. And it meant that I had to suddenly become, in a split second, essentially like a spy, work like a spy. Okay. And I'm okay at doing that, but I've taken some risks I don't think I should have at times with my witnesses. I'm not happy about that. It's not an unparalleled success. We did get some people out. The bottom line is, yes, this is an evolving situation. It's cat and mouse. There is no one single solution. Everybody there's something about techies that they just love to say, oh, well, we've got this perfect solution for what you're describing. It's like, no, you really don't. But if you can supply one component of it, kind of the way Signal revolutionized secure communication, those are the systems I want to work with. If I can work with a very good VPN, a very good place to store data and to share data, and a very good communication system. Those are the big three. Okay, those are the big three, but
and
even
that,
a VPN
with
even
good, sorry, with good, you probably mean like end-to-end encrypted zero knowledge technology.
Yes, yeah, I do mean that, and I mean even then we know perfectly well that we know that these systems, even with a VPN on, beautifully, all these systems out there leave some sort of fingerprints that a sophisticated country like Tajikistan, which has a lot of Russians working in their secret police and their monitoring, can pick up. We know that when you turn Signal on, or we suspect strongly, if you turn Signal on, it is like turning on a siren in the middle of the Kazakh desert saying, I'm here, come get me. I'm doing something very unusual. Okay. That's a problem. Okay. This is the reason why we didn't turn devices on in that country. For the time being, we can say that there are certain systems that don't set off the alarms.
And maybe this is the silver lining or the high note we can end on this talk at least, that there are solutions out there you can possibly use for some purposes, maybe put it like this. And security will always be a bigger framework than just one solution or than just one method or one technique. It will be a whole lot more to navigate the cyberspace more securely and to stay under the radar maybe of some systems or some people. But yeah, this was really nice talking to you, Ethan Gutmann.
Talking to you.
We will have some more time to talk to you, fortunately. So I'd say we're now very eager to learn about what the audience and the community has to say. So how do you feel? Shall we? I think we can move on to the Q&A session. We have the first question that is quite interesting, I think. You've mentioned some aspects of it, but do you have any concerns about TRESRIT from a human rights researcher perspective?
Let me be, I think I sort of said this in the talk, but I'm going to repeat it because it's an important point. Look, I'm a guy who's getting on in years. You start losing some technical ability. It just sort of, you lose the thread a little bit as you get on. So I rely on experts. Now, the experts I rely on is a company called IPVM. Now, those initials don't stand for anything, but IPVM is a really important research company because what they research is Chinese surveillance. They're experts at it. They've had people coming, feeding them information from inside China. They've come out with some very startling reports, and they're very well known in the security world. And one of the people I mentioned was Connor Healy, and I work with him quite often. I worked with him on the Kyrgyz family case, the family that we rescued. I asked him directly about this without prompting him in any way. I sort of said, how would I share documents in a secure way? And he said, well, don't use Google Docs. He went through a bunch of things I wasn't to use. And then he said, but Tresorit, we think Tresorits, we have really high, we think they have a really good reputation. And we think they're worth it. And they're not too large a company, and we don't feel they're compromised. Now I'm going with that. The second thing was that I found it a very easy interface, which is important when you're in the field. You don't really need to be gumming. You don't really want to work with something too complex when you're desperately trying to get an interview, or those pictures I talked about of a Chinese military base, and you're trying to get them into a safe space and then delete them. And we had very few failures in the field. Okay, so we lost one interview, but that was out of quite a few. And the problem again was probably connectivity, not Tresorit, so to speak, Tresorit itself. So I think that's my main confidence. The final thing I'd say is that I've dealt with companies for a long time. Larger companies have a lot of interest. Somewhat smaller companies don't. They're a little more customer focused, and that's extremely important in this case for human rights workers, because they need to have an actual. You sure?
Yeah, thanks, Ethan, for sharing. Maybe I can add something to this. Even if we had, so from a Treasury perspective, even if we had other and different interests into our users' data, we couldn't access them as it's zero knowledge architecture. So this is really at the core of Tresorit as a company, due to our patented encryption technology. We can't, even if we wanted to. So this is basically it when it comes to growing the company again. This is the security by design principles we're working on, or we were implementing just by design. So this is the Ethan Gutmann, and this is the Tresorit perspective on this question. I hope this was useful. Let's move on to the next one. There's a question on the Xinjiang files, the police files. I think not everybody is familiar with this. I know that this is about police violence in this region of China and about torture and claims like this. So maybe you can put this again into perspective and maybe say something about this.
Well, this was kind of a breakthrough report, which came out from Adrian Zenz, the German researcher. He also is a colleague of mine at Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation in Washington, D.C. We work together sometimes, not all the time, but he has some sort of deep throat inside China who leaked these files to him. They are actual police files. So in other words, they have maybe one camp where they have the mugshots of all the Uyghurs, mainly Uyghurs, some Kazakh, in the camp. That's unparalleled. We've never seen that before. Okay, every single person, and they're very clear mugshots, and it gives their blood type, interestingly enough, from my organ harvesting research. It gives their name. It gives a few personal details about each person. It also has pictures that are sort of, I guess, being used partially for training purposes. So it shows police torturing people. And they're photographs. Sometimes they look a bit staged, sometimes they don't. It's a little bit hard to determine what's going on, and that's typically Chinese, that they sort of mix in both staged training photographs and real photographs together. But so it was very dramatic material. It also contained a lot of information, which gave you a sense of kind of the flow chart of the systems, okay, a top-down police system in a camp in Xinjiang. Now, there are many, many of these camps, okay? We are talking about, as I said, a minimum of 1 million people. And it's interesting to note that when I was in Kazakhstan and doing my interviews, I never interviewed, everybody came from a different camp, every single person. And so, okay, so we're talking about 25 people or something, but that's still very striking. That gives you a sense of how big these are. And none of these camps actually had names. They literally, I mean, I asked them, well, what's the name of the camp? Now, some people could actually identify where it was on Google Earth, but a lot of people couldn't even do that. That tells you something about how secret this operation is, and that's why the Xinjiang police files were such an important contribution to the field.
Thanks for putting this into perspective. I think now the big picture is a bit clearer. And when we're talking about the whole of China, it is also about these big business relationships with the whole world, basically. And therefore, I think the next question is really important to many of our viewers. It's about the, let's say, East versus West again, somehow, Western states again, somehow. So how interested is China in spying on Western companies? What industries are they mainly interested in? So do you have some insights into this, or is this too far, so to speak?
No, I think, I mean, it's easy to make a comment there, but I'd just be very short about it. I think all companies are of some interest to China. Look, there are some things that actually have a direct impact that are dual use, so to speak, of both the civilian use and a military aspect as well, potentially. There are some things that are sort of in the middle. We're sort of, for example, organ harvesting, where you have, say, bioglue, which is a perfectly good product and used for, medical procedures, but it's also very useful in the transplant world. Okay, and so the Chinese want to imitate it, and they imitated ECMO machines, for example, which is an oxygenation method, so you can actually harvest somebody while they're still alive, while they're actually still living and the heart is still beating. And you can keep the organs oxygenated. They want to reproduce that technology. In some cases, they want to reproduce it even better. They're a creative society. The final thing is that, look, everything in China has a political or at least an economic aspect. So even when you're talking about tapioca production figures, they're not always true. At the same time, there are always Chinese companies who are competitive and want to reverse engineer any Western product, and also want to figure out ways to produce their own massive raw materials and so forth. And that gives some direction to things like the Belt and Road Initiative. So maybe I've answered that. It may be too China heavy, but I guess you get a feeling for what I'm talking about here. This is an endless cat and mouse game when you're doing business in China, or even partners of China.
Sure, I know what you mean. I've been working in medical technology a few years ago, and therefore had a little deep dive into, the whole sphere of healthcare and whatever, and also research and development. And if we look at the history again, it has always been, like, for 50 years now, a big giving and taking. But at the moment, it seems, if I look, for example, at SMBs in Germany, where I'm located, there's many Chinese companies buying these SMBs in Germany right now. So the strategy is clear, I think, where this is going to, and it's clearly life sciences, technology, and all these kind of relevant industries, I'd say. But I don't know anything about everything else, so I will keep my mouth shut now. And thank you.
I will have some revelations about your country and portable ECMO machines in my book. I don't want to give them away here. I have to hold back some secrets, but that's going to be an interesting story, because it also intersects with COVID. In fact, it probably dates the first outbreak of COVID back to June 2019.
That sounds interesting. However, we don't have the time, I think, to dive into this right now. So let's just move on to the next question, which is not that official level, so to speak, but rather a basic one. There's a question regarding what security measures can be taken to secure information, to protect data in general. And well, from a IT security perspective, at least, I have to say, security is always a framework, and it's never, the end of the framework. We can never reach this, as this is a cat and mouse game, as many of you out there might have noticed already. So let's just stick to the basics, so to speak, that are let's say, that prevents you from being a low-hanging fruit to hackers. So once you get your strong passwords right, once you get your software patch management right, i.e. Basic security patches of the providers and maybe also third-party providers, and get your firewall in place, have multi-factor authentication, which is not only, of course, having a password and having an authenticator app. This could be something else too. So there are also physical solutions that can be implemented, but we have plenty of information on this on our website, on the Treasury website, on the blog, on the knowledge base. You can also watch the webinar we had with Shannon, who is a private investigator and was also working for the authorities sometime. I don't know, I can't really remember, but this was a really good one in terms of how to securing hybrid network environments. And there were also questions like this. And the last thing I'd recommend are something like activity reports. I know in the private field, this is quite difficult to implement. But once you know what activities are taking place on your website, on your router, on your name it, you can prevent things from getting worse, at least, and you can monitor and react and put other and many more security measures into place. But I hope that I have touched the basics. Maybe Ethan, you have some more. I don't know.
I would just add one thing. I mean, I would just add one thing, Stefan. I mean, look, I don't mean to sound so negative about AI on a small scale use or sort of within a single company. If it's carefully done, one can actually set up the architecture so AI will read anomalies. It will see, what could be security breaches potentially, that kind of thing, just through the activity. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a really good use of AI. You can't have, with these systems and with people online, sometimes 16 hours a day, you can't expect everybody to go over everything all the time, to have a single individual doing that. But the AI can pick it up. And so in that sense, it can be very useful internally. And so as long as it's not misused. But so I have the same feeling. I mean, the point is, I do believe in proliferating systems a little bit. If you go with one system, it's a little bit like building a castle wall, and you sort of got this one big gate, and it's very easy. They can sort of target that one wall. Actually, what you want is this series of layered defenses, right? So it's fairly hard to get through. Now, one last aspect of it. It is very difficult to do patches in the field. Now, that's an anomaly of doing sort of human rights work or any kind of work that involves in the field work. The last thing you want is suddenly the computer updating in the middle of what you're doing, because it exposes it creates vulnerabilities and exposes all kinds of things during that period. So that was one thing I was very cautious about. I've just been told by British Naval Intelligence told me to do that.
Yeah, and you've taken me to another thing. Basically, this one I want to add to. From my training as a data protection officer, I learned that, at this point of time, most of the people are thinking about the digital space when thinking about data protection. But on the other hand, the basics also include not having something like this open, so to speak, on the table, or and with confidential data. Maybe there are some documents already printed out and you just leave it on the table, but you never know who's gonna step in. There are many people coming into a company every day, for example, and they could be whatever, in their second life or whatever. They could be not what it seems, or they could benefit from leaking something. When you're in an R&D environment, this is particularly important. So always keep in mind that this is not only about digital data privacy, but also about the physical world.
We just saw that 48 hours ago with Putin, and he was, they sort of had, he was talking about something, and apparently some people apparently read the watches in the crowd, and they didn't correspond with the time that it was being released. Now, they didn't get close enough to the watches to actually see the dates on the watches, but it was close. And, I'm sure somebody can pick up right from my background that I'm kind of into Russian literature. But whatever, right? In that case, I don't think that's too big a security breach. But, yeah, that's absolutely right. You have to be reasonably cautious about that. Again, I'm not that kind of super paranoid person. I believe that most of what you do should be quite out there, right out in front of people. It's no problem. But, this is the area of, well, that's just good hygiene, especially when you're in the field. So I always was very careful about any photographs that were released. In fact, when I was traveling in Kazakhstan, I had my son putting out pictures of me in London, because that's where I was living at the time. So I'd prepared various pictures, and suddenly it was New Year's, and I'm toasting everybody New Year's and having a party. And apparently it probably worked, because I have people who monitor my Facebook activity. And so it sort of let them off the hook. They could sort of say, oh, well, he's home. He's back in London, looking around. So I think it's just possible to use those details also in a deceptive phasing.
The turbulent life, Ethan.
I don't know. Not these days. No, these days I just have to write. But no, I love talking about this stuff. I like talking about it with the interesting to.
And this is good, and
some interesting questions.
Let's move on to the next interesting question, which is about security measures, but technology. So one guest of our talk was asking about the technologies that help the Chinese government to suppress dissent and control its citizens. So how could encryption, for example, work with that?
Yeah, it's not clear that most encryption is safe within China. And I'm not sure how they're doing that. I cannot answer that question. But I did talk to somebody who was a top expert in this, who's from China. He's from Xinjiang. He's a Uyghur. And he actually was the guy who created the equations which led to the first racial differentiation in facial recognition. So in other words, a camera, presumably Huawei, which could differentiate between a Han Chinese person and a Uyghur person, just on the facial structure. And it was apparently something like 95% right. It's very accurate. He also developed so this is where their system's very successful, a stress test. So it can actually, obviously our blood moves a certain way. Now that's something we can't really pick up with our eyes, but the camera can, and it can pick up the movement of blood, and something about that can give you the level of stress. So they were literally in China, the way this played out was they were actually carrying out arrest. If you were a Uyghur, it gave you like 50 out of 100 points. If you were then showing some level of stress, that gave you another 30 points. That meant an arrest, or at least to detain the person. So they were detaining people purely on their appearance. These cameras. That's a very high level of surveillance that the world's never seen. Other countries may have the capability to do this kind of thing. They don't seem to be carrying out arrests based on this, but China is.
So how can we then, this is another question, get the measures in place that prevent China from violating human rights? Is this on the states? Is this on the technology sector? What do you think?
It's probably on the diplomatic political sector. I mean, if China goes to war, invades Taiwan or blockades Taiwan, I believe they will there's a good reasonable shot that they may wipe out the entire Uyghur population, approximately 15 million people during that period of war. It's at least a possibility. Now, so part of it is keeping somewhat stable foreign relations. It's not desirable to have a big war. The second thing I would say is you have to make them pay a price. there's no way to stop the technology or the way they're using the technology exactly. But it is possible to interfere with business, normal business in these areas. They really shouldn't be, first of all, the obvious thing, Huawei should not be used anywhere in the West, right? You don't want any of those systems being sold globally. The other thing is it's possible to cut off other technologies which are coming in, which they're interested in. And it's not that hard to figure out what they are. We don't have to get into all the details there. It's an excellent question. Stefan, you.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
There was some noise in the background, so I had to mute myself. Now it's better. So thanks for answering this. And before we end this, maybe the last question for this session, as we're running out of time now. But I think there was a bit of confusion during the talk. There's a question for you, Ethan, and maybe also for me. So how would you convince people and companies to use a tool like Trezrid, and why is it worth the investment? Because this user understood, and I'm sorry for this was a misunderstanding, obviously, that we mentioned security breaches and they were not made public. Basically, this is wrong. This was a miscommunication, obviously. Trezrid is an unhacked company. So I dare you. There's also a competition going on. I think it's $30,000 US or something. You can look it up on the internet. The guy who hacks Trezrid gets this reward. So if you want to opt for secure and easy file sharing, I think you should take Trezrid as the solution. But let's see what Ethan has to say about this. So what do you think, Ethan? How could you convince this user to use a tool like Trezrid?
Well, I actually would advocate for a company like IPVM, which is their only business is internet security, for them to come out with a sort of a nice, easy top 10 list of the top products they see out there, even top 7. I think they've essentially done that with me. Okay, they've kind of given me their best picks, and there's nothing wrong with having a kind of one of those. People love lists, right? It's very attractive. That should probably be on there. Their main problem is companies which sell data. Okay. And I think the point, Stefan, you were making was that we can't even see the data, and we're certainly not selling it to anyone. And that's why we have to have a subscription-based service. But that is real protection, okay? That is the most important thing, because once somebody else is seeing the data, you just don't know how far that can go. And especially in a world which is in some mild level of crisis, we just don't know how far that's going to go. And you cannot trust, you're trusting suddenly a lot of people. And it's much easier to trust a small amount of people. And that's what I've done. I think the other thing I would mention, and this is more personal, is smaller companies, look, the larger the company, the quicker they give in to political pressure, to economic pressure, to the pressure of some other larger company. The smaller companies don't tend to do that as much. The customer service aspect is real, okay? Try to complain to Google sometime about anything, okay? I swear you will get nowhere very quickly. If I need to go off and do one of these crazy operations again somewhere, I'm not going to say a country, I can call, I can write to Trezrid, and I may have to get a little bit of a runaround, but eventually I get to somebody else, say, look, I'm going to be gone for like 6 months to a year. Can I just pay up front and that's done? And then you're not going to ask me for a credit card while I'm out doing whatever I do. And they'll do it. They can make arrangements like that. That's very important. Okay, every company should want that because the future is always very uncertain.
That's true. The future is uncertain. We're living in a time of crypto war, of cybercrime, of you name it. But still, I think we can have some trust in maybe less people than before, but we can have some trust. We can even leverage zero trust. So zero trust and some trust and digital trust, all these are terms that are currently out there. So it's you to decide what to use. And I'm happy that you, Ethan, as a 2017 Nobel Prize nominee, are really using our solution, which we are really grateful, as I said, and it's an honor to being able to talk to you. It's also for me nice.
I have no problem promoting products that I really believe in that have been field tested this way. I mean, that's part of what that's a sort of a minor part of what I do, but it's an important part.
Thank you so much. So looking at the time, I think we should have the final notice here. Our next webinar will be on the State of the Union of Trezorate. It's the summer update. And you will get every information you need to have on our feature and product roadmap. We have some really nice additions. Recently, we had an update on the email encryption function, the add-in and the add-on. And also, we are leveraging eSign. This will be available also at some point of time on a European qualified basis. So this is just for teasing, so to speak. The whole deal you will get on July 27. And now I want to thank again Ethan Gutmann. And I hope that there will be even more visitors to our videos on YouTube in the future. And the recording will be shared with the audience, and we will get to the rest of the questions right after the session. So Ethan and I will take care of getting the answers to you in a bit. So yeah, I hope to see you again sometime, Ethan. This was really nice, as I said.
I'll see you in Germany, Stefan. Sure.
That would be really nice. Have a nice day.
Okay, cheers.
Goodbye, and goodbye to the audience.